have anyone seen anything? Or there was no evidence there. So when I was questioned, well, what evidence have you? I haven't got any.
Your evidence was dead
was
children.
The commonality.
Dead children.
Yes.
Unexpectedly dying and collapsed children. That was the evidence of the problem, wasn't it?
Yes.
This was unexpected.
Yes.
So looking around, who was in the pool? Who might have had an influence on that? At that point, shouldn't the police have been called to investigate it?
Yes.
The fact is that you didn't actually, as a manager, need to take a position, did you? You could have simply said, this is an extremely serious allegation. My babies, who I am responsible for as a manager and a nurse, may have been harmed. I need to ensure that they and their families get the answers they need. And as importantly, I need to ensure that all babies coming onto this unit are safe.
Yeah.
That was your responsibility. And if you could not exclude the possibility that they were murdered, then you failed in that responsibility, didn't you?
Yeah.
Mrs. Powell denied having any favourites on the unit when she came to give her evidence, but Rachel Langdale Casey, who's the counsel to the inquiry, asked her about it, and she did admit that when she hired Lucy Letby, she did consider her to be the creme de la creme.
We've had evidence now that she failed and had to have a retrieval placement in her final year at university. How was it you came to describe her as creme de la creme with that history at that point?
When the students come through on the unit, you get to know them, because their placement is quite a lengthy placement. And those that don't want to be there are obvious. They've just got no interest whatsoever. But there are others that actually stand out.
Now, throughout the criminal trial, we heard a lot of evidence about how Lucy Letby's colleagues thought she was a good and competent nurse, and how she volunteered to work a lot of overtime on the unit, which we know was stretched and understaffed at times. So Mrs. Powell was asked about the deaths of the first 3 babies on the unit, baby A, baby C and baby D, who all died within a fortnight in June 2015. In particular, she was asked about Lucy Letby's behaviour following the collapse of baby C. She also said she knew the nurses were upset after so many deaths in quick succession. And you might remember the evidence of Dr. Rachel Lambie, who's told the inquiry there was a nervousness among staff and an air of anticipation before every shift. Mrs. Powell said she picked up on the growing tension as well.
What way did you pick it up, the anxiety? What did you sense or see?
Well, just that you just feel it, just feel the aura.
Tell us about that, the aura.
You just, when you come on the unit, sometimes you can feel it's quite jovial. You know, you can feel sort of the pressure in the air. But sometimes you go there and you think, oh, what's up? You know, what's happened? So you go and find out.
Were you feeling like that? Were you thinking,
yes,
what's going to happen now?
I was.
She said that by this point she felt something was going on, and she discussed the situation with other senior members of staff. And we know that it was around this time that Dr. Stephen Breary, the lead consultant on the unit, had noticed Lucy Letby was present at all 3 deaths, and he asked Mrs. Powell to put together a staffing chart of doctors and nurses who were on duty.
Was there a time you were doing that when you thought, actually, the police should be doing this, not me? I don't have the tools, I don't have the information, I don't have the powers to know what people are saying in their messages or anything else. Did you ever think that?
In hindsight, yeah, I do.
So in hindsight, when did that first occur to you, that actually you've been getting involved, and an unwilling investigator, because you supported her, it was one of your staff, wasn't it?
Well, nothing changed as far as evidence was concerned. Nobody saw anything, nobody heard anything. Nothing changed, and then the information was at the time. However, you know, as time goes on, you sort of think how things changed to reflect on that. And it is out of our remit in that respect, because you need some objective person to come in that's able to look at the information from an objective point of view.
So time did go on and more children died, and Mrs. Powell kept updating her chart as Lucy Letby's name came up again and again. But she insisted she didn't have any evidence that she'd done anything wrong.
Your evidence was dead
was
children.
The commonality.
Dead children.
Yes.
Unexpectedly dying and collapsed children. That was the evidence of the problem, wasn't it?
Yes.
This was unexpected.
Yes.
So looking around, who was in the pool? Who might have had an influence on that? At that point, shouldn't the police have been called to investigate it?
Yes.
Mrs. Powell said that in February 2016, she told Lucy Letby about the chart and that she was the commonality in all the deaths, which she said she took on board. What we actually know is in the weeks that followed, she went on to attack and kill 6 more children. But Mrs. Powell said she'd been told by Karen Rees, the head of nursing in the urgent care division, and Stephen Cross, the hospital's head of legal affairs, that she needed solid evidence or for someone to have seen her doing something wrong before she could be removed from working. Later, she said the director of nursing, Alison Kelly, also took the same view.
Can you remember how she expressed that to you?
She'd ask, had I seen anything? Well, if I'd have seen anything, we wouldn't have been having that conversation. We would have moved much further along. I hadn't seen anything. Nobody else had reported seeing anything.
She was also asked about the evidence Dr. John Gibbs has given to the inquiry. He said he was influenced by Mrs. Powell and her repeated assurances that Lucy Letby was a good nurse, which made him dither and not go to the police sooner.
Can you understand that? Your position that she couldn't have done anything may have impacted on the doctors.
I find it difficult to take that on board because I find that I don't normally influence the consultants.
By April 2016, Mrs. Powell said she'd moved Lucy Letby off nights onto working just day shifts, but she insisted this was for her own well-being and so they could keep a check on her practice, not because anyone thought she was harming babies.
I think the expression you used in your statements to the police, eyes watching her as well.
Yes, to see whether she was missing out on any other competency levels or whether she needed any additional assistance with the new machines that were in place. It gives an opportunity to check out her appraisal to make sure that there was anything lacking that we could deal with straight away, or if we could see any wrongdoing, that was also an opportune moment as well, because there were more people about.
So she said she attended a series of meetings in May 2016 where she told senior managers there were no performance issues with Lucy Letby. At one of these, she was noted to be vociferous in her support for her. Even after the deaths of the triplets in June 2016, she said none of the nurses believed she was responsible. But by then, Lucy Letby's position had become untenable.
But I felt at the time that something had to change, a decision had to be made.
Either for her to come back and ignore the suspicions, carry on as normal.
Which was untenable.
Was it?
Yeah.
For you, that was untenable?
Well, they couldn't the working environment was untenable with the consultants and the staff then. Because obviously the staff felt that she was not responsible.
Which staff felt that?
The majority of the staff.
The nursing staff?
Yes.
The nursing managers?
Yeah. No, the nursing staff.
The people who worked with her?
Yes.
Who were close-knit, you'd say?
Yes.
And did you think that?
At the time, yes. But after this incident, it...
After the deaths of OOP?
Yes.
The murders, we now know, yeah.
I wanted some resolution because it wasn't helpful for anybody.
She said Mrs. Rees organised for Lucy Letby to be moved into the admin role. But after the move, Mrs. Powell continued to support her, describing her as clever, exceptional and professional to the review team from the Royal College. She was also interviewed for Lucy Letby's employment grievance, and she told the investigators she was one of her best nurses and she was 100% innocent. She also referred to Dr. Ravi Jairam and Dr. Breary as brainwashing the other consultants against her. So before the break, we'd heard that Lucy Letby had made some mistakes on the ward and that Erin Powell had said many nurses had made mistakes. But Richard Baker KC, who represents baby C's parents, said Lucy Letby was Mrs. Powell's favourite. She described her as quirky and she'd been on a day trip to London to watch the Bodyguard musical with her and some other colleagues. Mr. Baker said she did nothing when Lucy Letby made mistakes because she was biased and she would make every excuse to protect her.
Did you see a particular connection to Letby?
No, we're all different. It takes a certain personality to work on the unit. Yeah, that's been quite evident. You know, over the years that I've been there, it is the quirky ones that actually survive the unit.
This fits with it suggestion, though, doesn't it? You saw as like yourself, that you were.
No.
She was
No,
a favourite of yours.
Quirky is different from the norm, as in perhaps sees things a little bit differently.
You see, the fact of the matter is that when it came to Lucy Letby, you favourited her. You
Nope.
gave her favourable
Not
treatment.
at all. Not in the slightest.
Mr. Baker also suggested to Mrs. Powell that there were very clear battle lines between the doctors and nurses after the concerns were raised about the spike in deaths, and she fell firmly in the nurses' camp. We actually heard from another of the nurses this week that Mrs. Powell ran the unit like a dictator. She said that Mrs. Powell and Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam were strong personalities who took an adversarial approach to working together. And this really goes back to the doctors versus nurses theme that we told you about a couple of weeks ago that's been coming out in the evidence we're hearing.
Letby was protected because she occupied an intersection between two things. She was a nurse who was being criticised by the doctors, and she was a nurse who you liked, and that's why she was protected, isn't it?
I think you're mistaken liking with actually supporting your staff.
We know there was a plan for Lucy Letby to return to the unit after she was cleared in the grievance procedure.
Mrs. Powell was also questioned by another of the barristers representing the families of Lucy Letby's victims. Now, this is Peter Skelton, KC, and he asked her whether she'd thought about the cases of Beverly Allett and Victorino Chua, who were both convicted of killing their patients. Now, she insisted that she and the other two unit managers, Yvonne Griffiths and Yvonne Farmer, did consider that someone could have been harming the patients, and they were discussing it all the time. But she said no one fitted the bill, and she didn't expect anyone to behave that way.
The key, Ms. Powell, was that you had senior doctors coming to you with concerns, and they couldn't find medical causes for these children's deaths, but they had found a common factor. That should have been enough to make you suspicious that these babies were being harmed, shouldn't it?
On reflection, yes.
What is odd about the communications at this time is that no one says the word murder or killing. Was there a sort of reticence about just even confronting the possibility that this could be happening to you and your colleagues?
Well, yes, we did. We considered it.
What it looks like is you dismissed it.
We considered it, yes, and we said it can't possibly be. It must be a commonality.
She became tearful when Mr. Skelton suggested any murderer would try to operate in secret, and she'd failed in her duty to protect the babies on the unit.
Why would there be the kind of signs of obvious murder that you were expecting to see? Why wouldn't the murderer, whether it's Lucy Letby or anyone else, have tried to operate secretly and covered their
It's very
tracks?
difficult in a neonatal unit to do anything secretly.
Well, it isn't, is it?
Obviously not.
I mean, it actually isn't. These babies were murdered, and no one noticed. You were not in a position, were you, to rule out the possibility
No.
that the children had been murdered, and you were certainly not in a position to rule out Lucy Letby's involvement in that murder, were you?
No.
And the fact is that you didn't actually, as a manager, need to take a position, did you? You could have simply said, this is an extremely serious allegation. My babies, who I am responsible for as a manager and a nurse, may have been harmed. I need to ensure they and their families get the answers they need. And as importantly, I need to ensure that all babies coming onto this unit are safe.
Yeah.
That was your responsibility. And if you could not exclude the possibility that they were murdered, then you failed in that responsibility, didn't you?
Yeah.
You recognise now that if professionals raised suspicions that couldn't be excluded and that were not obviously malicious, that the police needed to be called.
Yes.
And that should have happened as soon as those suspicions were articulated. Is that right?
Yes.